G'day, mate. Luke Ford here with John David Ebert.
Ebert.
Ebert, just like Siskel
Roger.
and Ebert.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, just like Roger.
No relation, though.
That's a shame. And we were talking about the movie The Witch. It came out in 2015, got pretty glowing reviews. What do you think of this film?
Yeah, I just watched it for the first time last night, actually, and I thought it was great. The film, it seemed to me, I really liked the use of the language. I think they got the sound of the sort of post-Shakespearean English down pretty well. It was pretty nice. They gave it a nice, authentic aura. But the interesting thing to me was where the film ended up. And it ends up basically with the vision from Nathaniel Hawthorne's short story, Young Goodman Brown, which is one of my all-time favorite short stories. Basically, Hawthorne and Poe were contemporaries, one in the South, one in New England, inventing the genre of horror fiction back in the 1830s. And so Young Goodman Brown is one of the first horror stories. And that story, for people who haven't read it, is set in Salem, Massachusetts, or just outside of it, where the narrator has a wife named Faith. And he goes out on an errand into the woods one night, and he notices strange things going on, and he sees that people are migrating into the woods, into the deep woods, and it's nighttime. And he finally gets into the deep woods, and he thinks he hears his wife's voice. And at one point, he comes to a clearing where all these witches are gathered around a central bonfire, and he recognizes his wife as one of them. Supposedly, she's supposed to be a good Puritan Christian, but here she's, one of the witches in this coven. And it really upsets him, and he goes back home that night and wakes up the next morning, and he's not even ever sure if it was real or not, but it disturbs him and basically destroys the rest of his life because she never comes back. So as far as he knows, she is indeed, has been deceiving him and has been a witch all along. That basically is the same scene. They borrowed it from the short story, obviously, that the movie, The Witch, ends up with the image in the clearing where the protagonist, the young girl, levitates up with a coven of witches who all float up, looking very much also like one of Francisco Goya's paintings of witches and covens and so forth. There's a visual allusion to that as well. So I like that very much, and I like the bleakness of it. And there's also another motif that I like, where the film starts out with this family who are being exiled from the town, or the plantation rather, that they're a part of. And they're exiled merely for disagreeing with scriptural exegesis, which I thought was a really interesting point, because these people took their Bible seriously, these Puritans did. And if you had a different version than what the prevailing consensus was, then you ended up in a sort of exospheric mode of exile out into the woods, the realm of the darkness, nature, the pre-civilized world, unprotected by any civilizational macrosphere. And so they're out there, and of course, this family, they have quite a few kids, actually, a couple of twins, and a boy and a girl, and another kid that gets taken by one of the witches and eaten. And one by one, this little family all disintegrates and dies off until the witch girl, the one who becomes the witch at the end, is the last one. It's wonderfully bleak, and it's my kind of genre, actually. I liked it a lot, I'll say that.
Now, what's the story with the father? Was he a weak man? Was he just a...
I think so, yeah. Yeah, I think so. He was not protecting his family, and he seemed totally bewildered by what was going on, and rather ineffectual, I think. But the supernatural forces, I mean, I think there was a certain degree to which the film was also alluding to M. Night Shyamalan's film, The Village, where the village is set in a kind of, it's actually set in contemporary society, but you don't know that because they've created this place out in the woods where these people have gone who have left the cities behind, rejected civilization, and gone back to living a very simple, plain Amish-type life. But none of them know this. The ones who didn't come with the original group don't know that about the cities. They think they're living in like the 17th century or something, as far as everyone else in the village knows. And they've got this idea that they have a wall built with torches up at night to keep out the others. And the others are, of course, monsters. They're like 9-foot-tall monsters with red demonic faces that occasionally get over the wall and get in. And eventually it's found out in that film that the monsters are fake, that it's actually the village elders, the ones who left the cities, who have created this sort of fake myth to scare people into staying into this village. It's brilliant. It's an excellent film. I thought of that film while I was watching The Witch. There's a lot of similarities. They both evoke a similar kind of world of being exposed, you know, out into back in a time when we were living before there were any civilizational macrospheres to protect us, where you were exposed not just to wild animals and beasts, but also to terrors from the astral plane, ghosts, witches, demons, and so forth. And so, you know, that's the way it was. And yeah, so that's my take on The Witch. That's a very good film. Enjoyed it immensely.
There's this just absolutely delicious blonde girl in this movie, played by Anya Taylor-Joy. She's just absolutely stunning. Like, in the midst of all this horror, there's this stunning young blonde girl. What do you make of her character?
Well, I mean, she's supposed to be young. She's 15-ish, I think, looks like. And she's supposed to be young because she's pure and innocent and uncorrupted. And that's what the Witch Coven wants. They want her. They want to bring her in precisely for that reason, because she's naive and uncorrupted and can be turned to the witch world of paganism and the occult and the ancient underworld, where basically what Christianity did was, and Milton, in Paradise Lost, and Milton was a Puritan. He was a contemporary. He's like 1670s in England. So he's an English Puritan who wrote Paradise Lost. And in Paradise Lost, he creates an underworld into which, as the narrative opens up right in the first book, Satan has been cast out from heaven along with all of his minions. And they arrive down in this deep pit, this underworld. And then Milton goes through and he chronicles all of Satan's minions, and you find out that all of them are basically pagan deities. Beelzebub, Dagon, Ishtar, all the pagan deities are now present in this Christian underworld, which now has to build a palace called Pandemonium and launch an army forth. But the interesting thing about that is that Milton has essentially scrapped antiquity and turned it into a midden heap, a junkyard in which all of those pre-Christian pagan signifiers have now been repressed into an underworld, and Christianity has sort of put a lid on that. And it stays that way pretty much down until the 19th century, when you start getting with these guys, Poe and Hawthorne, the Romantics, and the supernatural and fiction, Lovecraft, especially with Lovecraft, where they start chronicling the re-arrival of these beings from out of the abyss, from out of the underworld. One of Lovecraft's first short stories is Dagon, and he specifically refers in that story to Paradise Lost. So he had it in mind. So the vectors that you see in Milton going downward are reversed in Lovecraft, where we get the abyssal monsters now coming up out of that underworld into which they've been repressed by Christianity. And I think the history of popular culture ever since then has been one long chronicle of the invasion of our society by these ancient astral beings and spirits, demons, and all the way down to like TV shows like The X-Files. The movie The Exorcist concerns one of the demons, Pazuzu, who was an ancient demon from the Sumerian world. So that's the interesting thing, I think, about all this, is watching how, with the disintegration of our macrosphere, our sort of metaphysical immune system that was erected by the metaphysical age, that's pre-Christian, it goes back to the Greeks, covers Christianity, and goes all the way down to Husserl, which was Heidegger's edifice that he constructed there. When that collapsed, and by the year 1900, let's say, it was pretty thoroughly in ruins, then all these terrors came up from the astral plane, from the symbolic underworld, and have been invading our culture ever since.
So what makes a horror film? And it has something to do with the astral plane?
Well, I tend to think of horror as having two main genres, one where it does have to do with the astral plane, but the other where it does not, where the horror comes from sheer stark realism. You get serial killers, you get the stalker, the guy with a knife who's out to murder everyone at the camp, at summer camp. That's not astral. It just deals with our fears about things like serial killers and terrible things that people will do to you, you know, don't have the same kinds of civilizational apparatus holding their darker impulses in check as the rest of us do. That's a different kind of horror. But the other kind does indeed, and most of it actually, I think, comes from the other kind that has to do with the astral plane and the astral plane's relationship to the physical world. The astral plane is composed of all kinds of, not necessarily demons, but simply non-physical entities and spirits who don't inhabit bodies, but who are interested in finding bodies to possess and get into. They have a fascination with the material world. And most horror comes out of that tradition. I think very much in New England. The New England, basically, I think, despite Poe coming up out of Virginia in the South, horror fiction is pretty much an invention of New England. And it comes out of that puritanical fear and obsession with demons and astral spirits in the astral plane and witches. And those guys had demonology manuals that were made up out of these woodcuts, black and white woodcuts, where you would turn each page and there'd be a different demon on each page. So they really believed in these things. And from Hawthorne down to Lovecraft, there's a direct tradition. And then on now to Stephen King, who has all of his work comes out of the same area, you know, Maine in his case. But it's the same New England puritanical culture zone that was obsessed with the astral plane. And horror fiction really does come out of that. It's you know, there's a reason why King writes what he writes, located where he is, up in Maine. He's inherited a tradition. He's not a very good writer, but he's a very good storyteller.
I'm just thinking off the top of my head, whenever I hear the term Southern novel, there's always another word in between, Gothic.
Southern Gothic, right? Yeah.
Yeah, are there any Southern novels that aren't Gothic? And what does Gothic mean? I mean, is that part of the horror genre?
Not really, no. The South has a different take on all this, other than Poe, of course. Poe was a Southerner, so we have to separate him out from the rest of the South. I love Southern fiction, you know, Faulkner, especially Flannery O'Connor. And Cormac McCarthy, of course, started as a Southern writer and then became a Southwestern writer. Yeah, Southern Gothic, it has to do with the interest in the grotesque. That, like if you read Flannery O'Connor's Wise Blood, you know, there's something bizarre, usually physically bizarre, about each character that you encounter. And in Faulkner, if it's not a physical bizarreness, it's a certain psychological grotesquerie, a certain psychological extremity that each of the characters in his novels go to. And yeah, so the Southern grotesque has more to do with dealing with people who are limping and deformed, and they have bizarre religious mutations of Christianity that could only have originated there in this Southern sort of swampland world. And I'm quite fond of Southern fiction. I like it quite a bit. And it's more linked to what McLuhan used to call the oral storytelling tradition. The South came up out of the world of plantations. The North came up out of the world of industrialization. And Northerners like Hemingway, for instance, came out of the cities and the city world, the industrial world. It's got a different mentality to it than does, let's say, New England up above it, or the South down below it, which comes out of this world of plantations. So the thing about the plantations that first emerged in places like Virginia is that plantations were like miniature worlds where everyone had to learn how to be a kind of a generalist rather than a specialist. So you get these Southern gentlemen that knew everything about everything, or at least something about everything, like Thomas Jefferson, or people like that who were just incredibly well-rounded. And that led to encyclopedically well-rounded Southern writers like Edgar Allan Poe, you know, had a very encyclopedic knowledge. Whereas the North tends to produce specialists, writers who focus on cities and life in big cities, you know, like Dos Passos, you know, Hemingway and all of that. So that was McLuhan's analysis of the South being closer to the oral traditions. And of course, music comes out of the South, blues, jazz, rock, that all came out of the South. And the North has been industrial and has produced the North America's scientific civilization. But it's all reflected in the literature, which is very regional, very region specific. And it's a good way to study it too. If you're new to English literature or you're an undergrad in a class, it's a good way to just stick with a region for a while and read a bunch of authors in that region, then move to another region because they really do tend to cluster out that way. So,
is there any major Southern novel that isn't Gothic, or at least doesn't have a major role for the grotesque?
oh, I'm sure there is. Yeah, I'm sure there is, because there's so many Southern writers. The ones I tend to prefer are the grotesque ones, the Flannery O'Connor ones, with her bizarre people and serial killers and weird religious types, like in The Violent Buried Away.
Yeah, I just associate Southern literature with grotesque.
Yeah, that does tend to be its trademark, its stamp. That's correct. And I think Cormac McCarthy brought that, coming out of the Appalachian region there in the South, and starting with his first, let's say, 3 or 4 novels, which were all based on Southern grotesque stories, such as the novel Child of God. I think that was his 3rd novel, about this bizarre individual who lives in this town. Everybody knows who he is, and they all know he's bad news. He's basically a regressed and devolved human. He can barely talk, and eventually he murders a couple who are making love in a parked car one night, takes the girl with him up to his house, this decaying barn, and he's having sex with this dead girl night after night after night, and he thinks that's his girlfriend. That to him is a girlfriend. And then the house burns down, and he goes into these caves in this region, in the Appalachian Mountains, and he becomes this caveman. He actually regresses to the level of a caveman, and he starts killing people and dragging their bodies into his cave. And finally, they catch him at the end of the novel. There's a good film adaptation of this. They catch him at the end of the novel, and they say, we want you to take us to the caves and show us where all these bodies are, because we know they're in there. And at that point, he's lost an arm, but he leads them into the caves, and then he ditches them and eludes them, because he knows the system and they don't. And the last image of the novel is him going back and through one of the caves and pushes his way up out of the earth, like he's just born right out of the underworld. Once again, one of these creatures crawling up out of the underworld. Yeah, that's classic Southern grotesque right there. That's Cormac McCarthy right out of the starting gate, and he brings that into the Southwest, where he then becomes the Southwest's, really, I think, the Southwest's first truly great fiction writer. Larry McMurtry, who is also a Southwestern fiction writer, he's not on the same caliber as McCarthy. A few writers are. McCarthy belongs in the world with Faulkner and those kinds of giants. And in his book, Walter Benjamin and the Dairy Queen, Larry McMurtry says, the Southwest has not yet produced any truly great novelists. There's Wallace Stegner and people like that, but no truly great novelists have really come out of the South. But I think he wrote that before McCarthy had moved out here to Santa Fe to do the research for his novel, the big novel that everyone loves, the blood, the evening redness in the West. That's the one that everybody loves, and that marked the transition to the sort of cowboy literature that he developed from there, which isn't cowboy literature. It's a series of novels, including All the Pretty Horses and The Crossing and Cities of the Plain, which are analyses of cultural disintegration, the forces that cause from machinery, pressures put by industrialization that destroy these ancient rural and or nomadic ways of life that have just been there for centuries, and they just get wiped out. And that's McCarthy's main fascination in his later novels. From Blood Meridian on down, is this fascination with cultural disintegration, especially tracing it through the Southwest. And Mexico becomes for him a sort of border into the underworld. Mexico becomes a symbolic underworld that these characters are constantly going down to, having underworld experiences, and then coming back up to Texas or New Mexico or Arizona, wherever they come back to. And it's interesting because in the history of mythology, very often regionally underworld places tend to be located in southern locations in relation to northern locations, such as Greece vis-a-vis Crete. Crete was always associated with the underworld. That's why you get the King Minos building the labyrinth to house the Minotaur. They associated the underworld there with the south. Same thing with India vis-a-vis Sri Lanka. In the Ramayana, the great Hindu epic, the demon Ravana has come from Sri Lanka, to kidnap Sita and take her back to his abode in the symbolic underworld, this island of Sri Lanka. And in a similar way, I think with Cormac McCarthy's Border trilogy, and also No Country for Old Men, the South becomes, south of the border becomes this underworld that these characters cross and come back out of. And he associates it with the abyss. So it's very interesting to track these traditions of symbols and ideas that yet remain consistent, right down to living novelists. I mean, Cormac McCarthy is still alive. I've seen him. I've seen the dude walking around out here. It's quite a thrill. Yeah, so I love him. I love all of his novels. I just think they're amazing.
You remember the 2009 movie based on a Cormac McCarthy novel called The Road?
Yes, yes. That was another very good film. I think the novel's better, though. The novel, in that novel, the abyss has won, basically. And you can see it happen. You can see it coming for a long time. This theme of the abyss, and the abyss in McCarthy means nihilism. The danger of meaninglessness and nihilism getting into society and spreading. And you can see it coming. You can track it for a while until by the time you get to The Road, which is pretty much his most recent novel, except for the play The Sunset Limited, where the abyss has engulfed civilization. And it's just this cosmic outer darkness, you know, that has come in now and isn't outer anymore, like the title of the second novel. It's not outer anymore. And it engulfs civilization, and all the vectors are gone. All the orienting lines on all the maps are gone. We don't know what's where and where's where. And we just have this human story of the father and the child and him guiding him through this wilderness is the only vector that the kid's ever going to have. But it is about the victory of the abyss. And I think it's interesting because the play that he wrote after it, The Sunset Limited, which was made into a film with Tommy Lee Jones and Samuel Jackson, concerns a guy now who is a professor of English, played by Tommy Lee Jones. He's a professor of English who now is basically a deconstructionist, a sort of postmodern deconstructionist who thinks there is no meaning anymore. All the great metaphysical signifieds have been deconstructed. There is no meaning anymore, so why go on? And he's about to kill himself at the beginning of the film on a subway platform when this simple guy, I think he's a mechanic or whatever, Samuel Jackson, rescues him, takes him back to his apartment, and he says, "I'm not going to let you kill yourself. Why did you want to do that?" And then he tells him his whole life story, how he's just led up to all this view that he has of the world as totally meaningless and pointless. No recognition of spirituality or an other world or anything. And so when the abyss is victorious, that's the kind of situation you get, is meaninglessness. And people become hopeless and apathetic. They might try to commit suicide. And so that's McCarthy's most recent book. It's a few years back now, but you can tell it's like with the paintings of Mark Rothko, you know, the later paintings, the early paintings of those bright, luminous squares gradually give way to darker and darker squares until with the Demental Chapel, you just get these total black squares. The abyss has won, become completely victorious in his paintings. And he's lost the battle between being and what Heidegger called the nothing. The nothing has won at the end of Rothko's career. And he committed suicide, you know, cut his wrists at the kitchen sink. That's what happens when meaninglessness triumphs. You don't see any reason to go on. And our civilization now is suffering from a crisis of meaninglessness.
Now, let's get politically incorrect here and look at Cormac McCarthy, perhaps through the prism of race. He seems to equate the decline of white America, perhaps of Anglo-America, and the rise of Mexican-American with America falling into the abyss.
Maybe, but I don't read it that way. I don't know. I didn't get that feeling that he learned Spanish to write the novel. There's a lot of pages and pages that are in Spanish, which you can't read if you don't know Spanish. And all the Spanish characters the Mexican characters are portrayed sympathetically. I didn't detect a hint of racism in there. But the association, yes, of Mexico as a southern underworld with the abyss as a place that poses a threat to these older cultural worlds rooted in tradition and meaning in the Southwest, these cowboy nomads, ranchers, and farmers, and what have you. there is that equation, but I look at it ontologically and metaphysically, not through a racist lens. I think you could make that argument, I suppose, if you wanted to, but I don't think it works very well, because I don't think that was what McCarthy was interested in, and I don't feel that coming out of his work at all.
But you also see that racial theme I just talked about in No Country for Old Men, where you have kind of this mystery meat, remorseless killer who just can't be stopped.
Yeah, right. And he's come up from out of that abyssal world, right? He's an emissary. Instead of the characters in the Border trilogy going down there and coming back, this time we're starting to get abyssal entities coming up out of there and invading the culture to the north with this kind of meaninglessness, which is so... The Tommy Lee Jones character is this good old traditional guy, conservative traditional guy, and he just can't figure out where these kinds of monstrosities are coming from that would do these kinds of things to people that are just... They seem to be, I think maybe, McCarthy was saying, I think he's thinking more about the kinds of things that go on with the cartels and the kinds of incredibly brutal acts, the beheadings and so forth, the use of ballos. And so he wrote the screenplay for that Ridley Scott film. It's not a very good film or a very good screenplay that has the same premise. It's escaping me now, The Counselor, with Brad Pitt. It's not one of his better works, but it does have that same association with the cartels being associated with basically barbarians. I think for McCarthy, that world of the cartels represents the equivalent to what Toynbee would call an external proletariat. That is to say, the barbarian, uncivilized people who are beyond the walls, what the Romans called the limes, that have to be kept out in order for civilization to function. And once they get in, they bring us a wholly different order of values and meanings that pose a threat to this higher order organized ecumeny that the Romans built, that they regarded the Germans as being uncivilized. But the irony of all of that is that the Germans were pregnant with the future. They were going to create the next big civilization. In order to do that, they had to invade Rome, swamp it, overcome it, and bring in the Scandinavian world, which is a totally different, it's a pagan, pre-Christian sign regime with totally different values. And the Germanic world came out of that. The tension between the Franks in the south under Charlemagne and in the north, what became the German world, has been the sort of metaphysical bivalent difference engine that has polarized Western European civilization, and that has, created where it's at. So every society, in Toynbee's view, in his book, A Study of History, every society has an external proletariat of one sort or another that it defies as other and has to be kept out in order for the society to function. And it has an autoimmune system, or an immune system of one sort or another to prevent that, usually a metaphysical immune system, to prevent those peoples from getting in. Every civilization does this. Perhaps it is the case that North America, and here again, we're already talking about building a wall there. Once again, it's the old, this is going way, way back, that every civilization, when it enters what Toynbee called the universal state phase, the imperial building phase, defines the empire with walls, like the Great Wall built in China under Qin Shi Huangdi, once he created the great Chinese universal state and unified all of China for the first time in about 220 BC. And you just get walls going up all over the place. And perhaps the United States is at that phase right now in its civilization where it regards the South as culturally other and is threatened by it and has to build a wall to, keep out what it perceives or what certain elements of the society perceive as culturally other.
I remember when The Road came out in 2009, it seemed to be part of a whole series of films, none of which I can remember now, but basically about the end of the world, about a post-apocalyptic world. They all seem to come out in the first year or two of the Obama administration. Do you remember that trend?
I do remember it, yeah. I saw a lot of those films, and you're right, I don't remember any of them. They're pretty forgettable. They were all pretty bad. I think The Road was probably the best of the bunch. There was one I think called The Book of Eli with Denzel
Yes.
Washington. Yeah,
Yes.
Denzel Washington. That was okay, nothing special. But yeah, there was a whole bunch of those there for a while. Civilization Collapsing. What was the one with Nicolas Cage in it, with all the catastrophes, crashing planes and.
The Mayan thing?
No, it was Nicolas Cage dealing with prophecies and decoding prophecies about catastrophes that were unfolding, like planes crashing.
Yeah.
And it was directed by Alex Proyas. It's a one-word title that escapes me right now, but there's another one that came out of that. That one was pretty good. It wasn't bad.
What kind of movies do you think we're going to get out of the Trump administration? Surely President Trump is an epochal leader that's going to produce a certain kind of art in reaction to him. Do you have any ideas what kind of literary or theatrical art we might get that will come to embody the Trump era?
No, no, I can't even hazard a guess because he's such a very strange and disturbing singularity. I'm not sure. I still don't think that what is going to happen with him has happened. I don't. It makes me nervous. So who knows? I know that anytime you get propagandistic works of art, as with Russia when the Bolsheviks came in, or the Nazis, the art is pretty bad. It's pretty awful if that comes into power, and all you get is just propaganda that's official state doctrine that cannot be questioned, and anybody who questions it goes to a camp. But yeah, the reaction to that was mostly, to the Nazis was all these great literary artists like Thomas Mann, and people like the Frankfurt intellectuals escaping, moving to Adorno, moving to Los Angeles, and writing works there that were based on rejecting all of that kind of thing. And Mann's works were, he's one of my favorite writers. I mean, his books were extremely imaginative and very beautifully written, full of myth and culture and tradition, and very wonderful stuff. So it's hard to gauge what a reaction might be to an administration that is this sort of right, on the right as his is. I don't know. Very difficult to. I'd rather just watch and see them unfold and see what happens. Yeah, go ahead.
Have you detected any artistic reflection of the Trump era? Anything you've seen yet?
Not specifically of the Trump era, but there are certainly, I mean, Trump is what I regard as the first hyper-modern president. And I regard hyper-modernism as a new development. I think postmodernism is dead, done, and gone. I think it died in the middle of the 90s when the internet was made public. The internet was the death knell of postmodernism. Postmodernism, that was the thing that killed it. It was a brand new technology that anathematized all the structures of postmodernity. Postmodernity was analog. The hypermodernity is digital. And so film died basically as a celluloid analog medium and migrated into the circuits, into the matrix with digital cinema, which I regard as what I call post-classic cinema. I think that killed cinema. I think it's a different medium altogether, and it's no longer very interesting anymore. So I don't get out to see movies that much anymore because I think they're mostly based on cliches and repetition of formulae that worked in the 70s and 80s when film was a big deal and was exploding with creativity and creative imagination. So now all we get is remakes of classics like the Star Wars films or Blade Runner or the Alien movies or the Mad Max films or what have you. They just get recycled and rehashed, and they're nowhere near as good as they were. So I've been tracking it that way, mostly through the cinema as it has unfolded and has gone down from its peak into a post-classic mode. It's hyper-modern now.
What is postmodernism that it ended? Can you define what it is so that I know what died?
Yeah, postmodernism is what came about after World War II. Its philosophical branch originated in Paris in the 60s with guys like Foucault and Derrida and these individuals, where they attacked what they called grand meta-narratives, anything that was a totalizing, all-encompassing vision of history. Like, say, Rudolf Steiner's vision of the cosmos, or the Oswald Spenglers. So all of that gets anathematized and killed because those kinds of grand meta-narratives were regarded as what led to the catastrophes of World War II, with the Nazis and their grand meta-narrative contending with the communists and their grand meta-narrative and so forth. So that gets anathematized. And you can't do that kind of thing anymore with postmodern thinking. This is in the philosophical world. In the arts, something similar is happening in the arts about the same time, coming out of both New York and Dusseldorf. Dusseldorf with the contemporary artists there, especially Joseph Beuys, where Beuys liquidates all the previous artistic signifiers and says, we don't need those anymore. Let's come up with our own private art collection of objects that are very bizarre and strange and unusual, but he invents his own vocabulary for them, a private semiotics. And you can't understand a Joseph Beuys work of art without learning, without listening to him telling you the concepts that each work embodies. So that becomes a very new thing in contemporary art. It's postmodern right there, which is based on liquidation of previous iconotypes, previous archetypes, previous transcendental signifieds. And Derrida announced this in his essay on structure, sign, and play in the sciences and disciplines, when in that essay, which I regard as his breakthrough essay, he talks about how the great transcendental signifieds that have held the West together so far, let's say the crucifixion, the idea of God, or the soul and its freedom, those have all been liquidated now, wiped down, and now the ontological heart of the West has an absent center to it. And because there is no transcendental signifieds in that empty center, what I call a semiotic vacancy, which I think Mark Rothko, meanwhile, in New York, was making visible with all of his semiotic vacancies in his paintings, that Derrida filled then with what he called the play of signification. Then you can interpret anything you want, just as long as you can have all these signifiers, like ice skaters skating over a surface of ice. Signifiers now have come detached from their signifieds because the signifieds that anchored them are gone. And so there is no fixed way to interpret a text. There is no, if we wanted to go back to James Joyce's Ulysses, we would not then look at what Joyce said everything was supposed to be, because we could interpret it any way we want. It's the play of signification now. Multiple readings, and each reading is itself kind of a way of anathematizing the author. Roland Barthes announces the death of the author. We can no longer trust the author. Critical interpretation now becomes superior to the authorial voice. And so secondary interpretation and elaboration comes in now. And so all the authoritarian structures that anchored and held the West together metaphysically, ontologically, and artistically get melted down and liquefied in postmodernity, both in art and in philosophy. The French liquefy the subject. The subject is wiped out. That's postmodernity, and it's based on this eclecticism of play of forms. Postmodern architecture with Robert Venturi, or any of those guys. You can have a building designed like a sort of grandfather clock with maybe some Greek columns at the bottom, or whatever. You can start mixing and matching all these different eclectic historical epochs and their styles. That's a very postmodern thing to do that. So,
and then how would you define hyper-modernism?
Hyper-modernism represents the exit from all of this into the interior, the world interior now of cyberspace, which is entirely digitized. In postmodernity, we had shopping malls. The first great shopping mall comes in 1956 in Edina, Minnesota, designed by Victor Gruen. That becomes the world interior of the postmodern shopping space, where you go, all the technology is analog, and all that gets liquidated down once the internet comes along, and all these bookstores start closing down. Shopping malls are now dead things. They're already in the past. They're shells, pretty much. They're littering our landscape across North America, everywhere, probably all over the world. And so the world interior becomes digitized, and the subject now is retrieved through a sort of the creation of avatars, flat two-dimensional selfies, narcissistically self-preoccupied selves that can be projected into this very flat two-dimensional sort of world of cyberspace, where everything is plugged in and turned on and sent beaming through the matrix. And so the self becomes something that is unstable, under constant liquefaction, but yet can constantly pull up a new mask, stabilize itself, present itself with this mask, And each person has their own sign regime. Each person has their own private set of symbols and signifiers that are me. You know, donate to my Patreon and I'll give you more of me. And so every individual now is their own performer looking for their own audience. The celebrity was a big thing in post-modernity. The great celebs that we all would go to see, Elvis in Vegas or Marilyn Monroe, and that's gone now. So that all has been democratized now. So celebrities are dead. That's a thing of the past. In hyper-modernity, those have been liquefied now and democratized so that every individual now can be their own sort of micro celebrity with their own following. So it opens up a whole new different world interior now with a different play of signifiers than what was going on before. So it's just a very different world.
So what happened to your Patreon?
Oh, it's up and going.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Do you remember the link?
Yeah, I can put it in at the end of this. Send it to you. Yeah, that would be helpful if anybody wanted to contribute and keep these videos and things going. Yeah, the more time I have to devote to this, the more stuff I can put out. I have lots of projects going right now. I mean, an enormous amount of stuff. I'm working on a graphic novel right now with someone, a very talented artist, and writing a book now on hypermodernity where I'm defining it and still doing YouTube videos. So there's a lot of projects going on. So yeah, any contributions to my Patreon would be warmly and greatly appreciated.
So was there anything, did the characters in The Witch, did they bring it on themselves? Did they sin in some ways that then precipitated the forces of evil taking over?
I don't know. That's a good question. That's the kind of question that we could sort of raise and play around with and dig up. Maybe. I don't know that I would say that they brought it on themselves. I mean, because after all, they were exiled simply for differing in their interpretation of the scripture. I wouldn't say they brought it on themselves. It's just that they were put out beyond the pale where they no longer had protection metaphysically and immunologically against the forces of darkness, which simply overwhelmed them. Because in the situation that they were in the plantation, you're protected not only physically, but also metaphysically by things like the cross, Christian liturgy, the Bible, all that world of signifiers, which was designed and erected, as we said earlier, to send these demons down into the underworld and keep them from getting in. They all those signifiers not only keep them from getting into our society, but keep them from getting into our skulls as well. Because once they get in there, then you get things like madness. When you get possession by a demon or something like that gets inside of you, then you get all kinds of mental illnesses. And so civilizations in which the metaphysical immune system is no longer working, the physical walls don't work on one plane, so that leads to the external proletariats coming in on one hand, but they usually can't get in unless there's a break in the metaphysical immune system. And the metaphysical immune system is simply like the prevailing religious worldview, the metaphysical ideas of that society. Those keep psychological illnesses at bay in the micro world, what Peter Sloterdijk calls the microsphere, the individual unit. The macrosphere is the larger unit. Both have membranes that are designed to protect the psyche from those kinds of mental illnesses that are personified by these demons and spirits and monsters of the astral plane.
Would a Christian looking at this film, wouldn't his normal reaction be they sinned? The older brother had all sorts of incestuous thoughts about his sister. The sister played with witchcraft. The father wasn't an upright guy. You can certainly make a case that their sins brought on their troubles, right?
Possibly so, but I didn't get the sense that they were doing any of that stuff when they were living in the plantation. Seems like they got into that once they were out in the woods, exposed to all these kinds of extra civilizational or pre-civilizational influences, nature, and it's the way that it is it's lawless and doesn't obey the laws and rules of civilized society. So natural impulses and desires come up, which in a civilized order are forbidden for a reason, to keep the social order stable. But once you're out there and you're exposed to these other things, and you don't have a good immune system in place to protect against these invasions, then you can fall prey to it. So I don't know.
Did you see the Sicario films?
Let's see. I think I did. Isn't
Okay.
that the guy who directed Sicario? There was the guy who directed the Blade Runner sequel, Denis de Villeneuve, right?
I believe
I'm
so,
not sure.
yeah.
I
Sicario.
saw it. It didn't make any impression on me. I don't even remember. I do remember watching it, but didn't make any
Right.
impression on me.
What about Breaking Bad? Did you see that?
I think probably that's the best TV show ever done. It's up there. It's way up there. Yeah, that was a work of art. That was something to watch that unfold. I watched it season by season as each one came out, and I couldn't wait for the next season. And I was disappointed when there was only 5 of them because I wanted to keep going on. Yeah, that character was really something else, wasn't he? It was really fascinating watching him struggle for power there. He had lost the phallus in his relationship with his wife. She was henpecking him. He had no power whatsoever. His brother-in-law basically treats him like shit, condescends to him. He's this sort of failed chemist who winds up teaching chemistry at a high school, and he has to work at a car wash to make ends meet, and they're still struggling, and then he gets a cancer diagnosis. It's like, how bad could your luck be, right? I mean, at 50. So things are not looking up. And then slowly, he hooks up with the kid, and they start making the crystal meth, and start interacting with these underworld elements. But because he's so intelligent, and I think this is one of the things I like about this, so many of these films and stories feature the primary protagonists solving their problems simply because they're tough guys. They're not particularly necessarily bright. They're just tough guys. And they prove that they're tougher than the other guy. I've got more machine guns than you. That's not the case in Breaking Bad. Walter White sort of ascends through this underworld as a great crime boss simply because he is so intelligent and he figures everything out, and he has an incredibly intelligent solution for every one of these problems. And I liked that the communication of the subtext of that film was that intelligence can save you. Intelligent people can do well, because I think there's an anti-intellectual bias in the society right now that the intellect is a liability. It's something that gets in the way. You don't need it. Our problems can be solved with force and violence. They can't. It requires intellect and intelligence. And that was very refreshing to get that kind of a hero that, you still get the crime noir narrative with lots of violence, but it's got a different inflection to it. So I thought it was wonderful. Almost Godfather quality writing on that. Just it's so good. Vince Gilligan was the writer on that. He used to write for the X-Files. Very talented.
And again, isn't Mexico the source of the underworld and the mayhem?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Yeah, same thing as in McCarthy, right? But they're again connected with the cartels, the drug industry. I don't see either of those two writers, Vince Gilligan or McCarthy, saying it's just the average decent, Mexican person living in a house and doing their best to survive that's the threat. It's these fucking cartels, that's the threat. Their lawlessness, their creation of these world orders unto themselves that are like tribes, like ISIS, these tribes that are just purely violent and have no limits to the amount of violence that they will inflict to get what they want. That's different from us. In a civilized order, we try not to do that. We've got all these other things in place, checks and balances and laws and rights to try and prevent that from happening. But those societies don't think that way. And so that's why they appear to writers like McCarthy and Gilligan as a threat. I don't think there's any racist overtones.
One thing I love about Breaking Bad is how it illustrates what Tom Wolfe argued, that the deepest and strongest human desire after survival is to feel important, is to try to raise yourself in status.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, Viktor Frankl said in Man's Search for Meaning that a person will bear almost any kind of suffering inflicted on him as long as he's got a meaning for why he should endure it. Because that's what he found in the concentration camps. Why should I go through this? Why not just die like he was seeing all his companions die around him? And he realized that the one thing the Nazis couldn't take away from him was his freedom to interpret the situation in any way that he wanted. That was the one freedom they couldn't take. And he chose to interpret it as a revelation, as a test, a Book of Job type endurance test that he got through. While many of his companions who couldn't arrive at that meaning didn't. And so out of that comes logotherapy, and the idea that meaning is maybe it's not the most important thing, but it's incredibly important, very, very important to living a good life that makes sense to you. And I think that the disintegration of meaning that we're facing right now in our civilization is a disaster. It's a terrible thing, and terrible things will come from it. It's not a good thing. People need to have meaning systems. They can't just be liquidated and erased like an eraser erasing chalk on a chalkboard. It's not, you can't do that with these things, because I call them archive. You can call them whatever you want, these meaning systems that function as codes for everything that that society does and can do on the physical plane. So if you wipe out those codes, then the society starts slipping and crumbling and liquefying, and you get the kinds of social chaos that we've got now.
It seems like every movie and almost every novel I read, the lead characters come a cropper because they don't have any meaning greater than satisfaction in their own instincts. Just take Breaking Bad. Walter White's #1 motivation is not taking care of his family, it's to feel powerful and important.
Right.
If he had a single streak of transcendence in his life, be it religion or some kind of spirituality, or even some kind of transcendent cause, communism or fascism, or anything. If any of these characters lived for something that was greater than the satisfaction of their instincts, I just sit back watching these TV shows and movies and always think they would avoid trouble if they lived for anything greater than their own instincts, which I think is another way of restating the meaning problem.
Yeah, I think so too. That's a good way of putting it. I like that.
Because you see with Walter White that his addiction is that he feels alive when he is important in his work, and compared to that rush, nothing else.
Right, he gets addicted to that. Yeah, he gets addicted to that, and he wants more and more power as he goes along. It's a little bit like The Godfather in that sense. The same kind of thing with Michael Corleone, where he becomes addicted to power and he puts that ahead of family interests and compassion. Has his brother shot, and for Christ's sake. Yeah, it's a very similar kind of plot vector.
I once saw a marketing talk, and the guy says, think about who you're selling to. You're not selling to the middle manager who pushes paper around. You're selling to that guy's deepest dream, which, let's just say, is to be a rock star. And then his real dream is not to be a rock star, but to live in that kind of peak state, what he imagines to be a peak state with love and admiration. Yes. And so when you're selling something, you're trying to sell to that desire that everybody has to live in a sense of flow, or to live like in a peak connected state. And when people stumble upon it, if they don't have some kind of transcendence in their life, they will then just pursue, what they stumbled upon that satisfies their instincts for feeling important.
That's very true. Yeah, transcendence is absolutely important. I think there should always be some form of transcendence that's available to the individual, because we're not just animals here. That's not correct. Science wants us to believe that that's the case, but they're wrong about that. We are human beings. We've come from another world down here to create experiences using these bodies. So there's that spark of intelligence is a light from another world shining like a flashlight down here in the darkness, and we're trying to illuminate it. And when people don't have, when systems of transcendence such as religions are liquidated by deconstructionists, let's say, they lose the point. They miss the point that once that goes down the drain, the individual then is stuck living a life where he or she thinks all they're driven by are animal desires and motivations. And that's not the case. The human project is to transcend that. We have to deal with it because we're living in animal bodies, but we have a spark that the animals don't have, that we can overcome that and transcend it through human experiences, metaphysical, spiritual experiences, contact with spiritual beings in the other world. That's a whole different thing. And that's what a human life is all about. That's what this project is that we're engaged in right now. People need to know that. And once they do know it, it straightens them out. One way or another, once you realize that, you get a whole different view of what all this is about. You get an orientation, an axial orientation between this world and another world. Especially if it happens to be the case, which I think, that the other world is about love, and this world is a sort of cosmic game set up where all the ground rules are against love. They're all based on selfish, egoistic needs and desires, animal needs. Everything on this planet is hostile to everything else, killing and hunting everything else. So the project becomes, how do you bring love from that other world down into this world? It becomes a kind of game to see if that's possible. How and when and where is that possible? It's a very difficult thing to do. And I think this was what Christ's message was, that he came down to give us this message, that it's actually about love, not your tribe versus my tribe. It's about love, overcoming boundaries, embracing, opening up your selfish ego, widening it to encompass others, the other, more and more larger groups that are seen as human and not other. That's what I think this is about, what we're doing on this planet.
I remember when I was about 6 or 7 years of age, I stumbled upon a technique that made all my problems disappear, and that was to like check out into fantasy, where I just start telling myself stories.
Yeah.
And so
me too, actually. I did a lot of it.
Okay. I figured we're kind of kindred souls here.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, a lot of that I did was through reading. I would just read and read and read, mostly fantasy, science fiction, horror stuff. But that stimulated my imagination. So then I started writing. That's why I'm a writer to this day, was liking those stories and wondering if I could write them as well. So I just started writing short stories and fiction from the age of 7, I think, and just kept on doing it, and that saved me. That was what gave meaning to my life. In a similar way to what you're saying there, it oriented me, gave me something to live for. Surrounded by all the crudeness and vulgarity of Phoenix, this place that I grew up in, it's just this megalopolitan machine for living that has no soul, no tradition, not connected to the past. It'll be gone in a couple of centuries when all the water dries up. It's totally irrelevant. It's a historically irrelevant place. And so growing up surrounded by a city that's just nothing but meaninglessness everywhere, that's what I found to guide me through the darkness and eventually open up to higher and higher and higher meaning levels and systems.
Right. So I similarly started writing stories at about age 9. And so this was an adaptive technique for me for a while, but then it became eventually maladaptive, so that I was sitting in class and I was daydreaming. I did a lot
of that too.
Yeah, I was at work, I was daydreaming. And then I started dreaming over girls, starting about 6th, 7th grade, and just getting high from dreaming about girls in my class. And that reminds me a little bit about the movie Vertigo, where you have the lead character, Jimmy Stewart, who's a retired detective, and he falls in love with a fantasy. And
so that's right. I remember that. Yeah.
He pursues his fantasy. His fantasy takes over his life. And once again, I feel that if he had real transcendence in his life, if he had real human connection, if he had something he believed in that was greater than himself, that was greater than his own fantasies, that was greater than his instincts, he would not have gone off the rails. This was a man who found in the state of fantasy that suddenly this took him out of his humdrum life and made him whole. But then that made him vulnerable to a scam that a level-headed person would have been much less likely to have been involved in. So for me, the movie Vertigo illustrates this same point, that we need real connection, real love, and real transcendence, so we don't get sidetracked by our fantasies.
Yeah, that's Kim Novak, right, who plays the fantasy one? Yeah, right, I remember. Okay, it's been a long time since I've seen it, but yeah, that's a pretty good reading of it. I like that. She's sort of like his muse almost. She's the alluring woman who leads him off into the darkness, and who knows what's going to happen to him.
But he's so desperate for something to make him feel alive that he just gets lured away. And the same thing happens in Double Indemnity, the 1944 noir film. You've got this very successful insurance salesman, Fred McMurray, but he meets Barbara Stanwyck, who's married, but
I remember now.
He gets intoxicated by, I assume, not so much her reality, but his fantasy of who she is. That he ends up committing a murder
Yep.
and ends up costing him his life because he's pursuing a fantasy of what life could be, because he doesn't have the real thing going on in his life.
Yeah, I remember that. I read the novel, the James M. Cain novel, actually, that was based on quite a long time ago. I liked James M. Cain's novels. The Postman Always Rings Twice is another one he did. Those were all really good. And the films were very good, too. Yeah, excellent.
So what are some of your most important books that you'd recommend for a general audience?
But depending on, are we talking about nonfiction or fiction or
either? Just
either. Okay.
Talk to us about some of your books.
Well, I think The Decline of the West was the game changer for me as a kid, or as a college kid. Nothing meant anything before that book to me. I was reading all the pop fiction for a decade or so by that point, but that book introduced me to the world and showed everything, not just as this random collection of works of art here. The Greeks did this, Beethoven did that. It was like, I couldn't make any connections to anything, and none of it mattered to me. And my college education was terrible. At Arizona State University, it was awful. But I happened to stumble across that book, read it. I flipped to the charts in the back, and I saw how he had all these civilizations lined up with these distinct phases that each one went through: an early religious, pious, metaphysical phase, a middle metaphysical, philosophical phase, then a late decadent, corrupt phase where the city intellect takes over and hijacks the society, gets rid of metaphysics, and reduces life to the lowest common denominator. Once I saw the basic arc of civilization, everything changed from that point. And I just spent years pursuing works on history that made sense out of what Spangler was talking about. I would read Egyptian history and learn it in detail, or Chinese history, or Mesopotamian history, so I could see how he arrived at this wonderful conclusion. So that I would recommend. It's a hard book to read. The average person probably isn't going to have much luck with it. You can read it in an abridged version, which is how I started flirting with it as a college kid, and go from there. So there's that. I would also read, though, one of Joseph Campbell's books, any of them. They're all great, but The Hero with a Thousand Faces is a wonderful book because that sort of does the same thing for myth. It gives you, Campbell had read Spangler, and it gives you what he calls a monomyth, the basic hero myth structure, where the hero is in a situation, there's some kind of a wasteland, there's something wrong with his society, and he has a call to adventure that leads him out. He hears the call, he leaves that society, goes on a journey, undergoes tests and trials, finds something that's been missing from the society, the grail, let's say, and brings it back. So separation, initiation, return, and what he brings back revivifies and rejuvenates the society. Jordan Peterson robbed this for his book Maps of Meaning, although he says he doesn't like Campbell and didn't read him. But he's got a very similar kind of structure. He doesn't have all the nuances of myth that Campbell had, but that's another one that I would say is very important. As we were talking about earlier, I think Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning is excellent for reading how do you survive the worst situation you can ever be in. You should know that. You should know that someone has done it, and therefore that it can be done, whatever happens to be your life situation. So that's a very good one to give you a model for working through something that's a challenge to your very existence. So that's good. I would also read, let's see, most of the stuff that I like is very difficult. I can't recommend Heidegger, or Foucault to a general audience, but there are good self-help books too that I found very good. Every once in a while, I've gone back and read a good self-help author like M. Scott Peck's The Road Less Traveled. I thought was a very good book. It helped me navigate through a lot of life difficulties. The road less traveled is that road that the hero in the myths goes out into the forest. He leaves the village. The way of the village is a way of safety and security. And if you never leave the village, you're not going to find anything out. You're not going to learn anything but how to live according to village rules. So you have to take the risk to go on the more difficult path. And M. Scott Peck talks about it in that book. That's another good book for learning about those kinds of things. Anything by Nietzsche, of course. The Genealogy of Morals and Thus Spake Zarathustra, those are masterpieces. Very difficult philosophy there again to work through. And I'm very fond of the novels, let's say, of James Joyce, especially Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. Those are masterpieces. Anything by Proust, Thomas Mann, those kinds of guys. In a contemporary society, Cormac McCarthy, and Thomas Pynchon, people like that. Doris Lessing is another one of my favorites. I think Doris Lessing's novel, Shikasta, is an absolute masterpiece where she creates this sort of science fiction vision of aliens who have created the Earth as an experiment, and they send these alien beings down on incarnational missions to go down to the Earth to undertake and undergo certain tasks. And the Earth breaks. The Earth is called Shikasta, which means in their language the fallen one, because it's had a fall where it's lost attunement with the high frequency of the aliens from where they're at. And so it becomes a lost project that they keep sending avatars down into to try to salvage. And she covers the entirety of human history in that novel. That came out in 1979 from the UK. Doris Lessing was a British writer. That's a magnificent piece of work. Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad is another one of my favorites. The journey, that's the prototype for Apocalypse Now. The journey through the jungles there, the true heart of darkness. That is the dark path that he goes through. The people in civilization who are protected are never exposed to those kinds of darknesses. It's a little bit like The Witch in that sense. It's the kinds of things that he encounters out there, which corrupted and ruined this man, Kurtz. So those are some things I would throw out there off the top of my head that I think people would enjoy, and that would help them actually figure out the meaning problem in their lives.
What about some movies to change your life, particularly to help people to fall in love with life again?
Oh, well, I thought The Truman Show was a very good film. That was an excellent film. The Jim Carrey movie. Have you seen that?
Yes.
Where,
yes.
Yeah, I thought that was great. I mean, here's a guy who finds himself in a situation where everything around him is fake. It's a simulacrum. It's like our media-saturated world that we think is real, but it isn't. It's made up of ghost phantom images and things that are beamed at us through all these various media that we think are real, and they're not. And then he penetrates through that. He goes on a meaning quest that leads him outside the dome of this world sphere that's a fake dome, basically hyperbole for the mediatized world. And he gets outside of it and penetrates to the possibility of some kind of transcendent relationship with a cosmic other. They had Ed Harris character as just kind of a stand-in for God. So that's a very interesting film, something. But I also liked, Steven Spielberg's. I know we talked about Spielberg last time that we didn't like him, but I love him a lot. And Close Encounters of the Third Kind was for me a film that I saw as a kid that was like a spiritual experience. I think that was the first time I'd ever had this sense that there could be these beings from other worlds. There could be this spiritual transcendent dimension that's greater and higher than what we experience down here in boring world. And I just find that film very elevating and uplifting. Again, the possibility of accessing transcendence. All those kinds of things made me feel good, made me feel more alive as a person. Those kinds of films.
What about Cinema Paradiso?
I don't think I've seen it, actually.
Oh. And how about A Perfect World with Kevin Costner as an escaped convict?
Also haven't seen it.
Oh, okay. What are some of the most important books that you have written that you'd like people to know about?
Oh, gosh. I think it comes down to 4. It would be Dead Celebrities, Living Icons, where I analyzed the cult and culture of the celebrity, the postmodern world of the celebrity, before it became hyper-modern. And then The New Media Invasion, which at the time I was analyzing basically hyper-modernity, but hadn't invented or come across a term for it. I didn't invent the term hyper-modernity, but I think I'm one of the first to really clarify it, because I couldn't find any good meanings on the internet. I couldn't find any real good discussions of it that made much sense to me. So The New Media Invasion, which is about all of this stuff and how it's changing what it means to be human under these conditions. And then The Age of Catastrophe, which is my book about how catastrophe seems to be piling up more and more through the 20th century, and they've gotten bigger and bigger until now we're in the global catastrophe. now that we're dealing with global warming and the ice caps melting. And then finally, I think my book about contemporary art, which is Art After Metaphysics, which is an analysis of the situation of how to understand contemporary art, which is a very difficult art to understand. And I decided to dive into it and learn it and understand it and figure it out. Those tend to be, I think, my four best books. But my most popular, my best-selling books, though, are the movie books that I did, scene-by-scene books. The Shining, scene by scene. Apocalypse Now, scene by scene. Blade Runner, scene by scene. Alien, scene. Those are consistently my best-selling ones. I think grad students like those. They're popular in college classrooms.
Did you know Joseph Campbell in real life?
No, I came along to the Joseph Campbell Foundation. He died in 1986, just as I was leaving college. And then the Joseph Campbell Foundation was in the middle of editing his posthumous books when I wrote a letter to them a couple of years after he died, asking if they needed any help, because I knew all of Campbell's books by heart at that point. And so then I hooked on with them at that point. I met his wife, Jean Erdman. She was very lovely and elegant, and a lot of the people who knew him, but not him, no.
So you were deeply immersed in the world of Joseph Campbell for a long time, then you
Yes.
left it. So upon reflection, did you change in your high regard for Joseph Campbell over the years?
For a while I did, because that was necessary to get out of his head. I think I was stuck inside of his head. And a lot of people do this. They make this mistake that they come across someone who makes sense out of the whole world for them, and they think that's the only sense that can be made out of it. So they stay stuck, and so they become like a Jungian. For a while I was, a Campbellian, let's say. Other people get stuck in other people's heads and never get out of it. But it took me a while, and I did find a way out. So I did become critical of him for a period, just as a necessary way of distancing myself from him in that world, the world of the Jungians. I got kind of sick of a lot of things about it that I thought were intellectually stifling and limiting, such as the Jungian dogma that all myths are based on archetypes of the collective unconscious that exist only as metaphors in the psyche. That to me seems very stultifying and limiting. And I think there's all kinds of things going on in myth that has nothing to do with just symbol and metaphor. Of course, there's a lot of that in there, but there's a lot of other things in myths. So yeah, I was critical for a while, coming across the works of William Irwin Thompson. Thompson was pretty vitriolic in his criticisms of Joseph Campbell. And when I came across him, he started pointing me in other directions. Well, you need to read Marshall McLuhan. Campbell didn't know anything about media studies. He stopped reading books after 1945. His imagination just remained stuck in the modernist pre-World War II mentality. Joyce and Mann and Leo Frobenius and Spengler and all of those guys. Whereas with Thompson, he had moved out of all of that, also interested in myth studies and in social and critical analysis. And he kind of turned me on to being critical about Campbell and leaving that world behind. And I finally realized that, yeah, it was time to look. It was time to have my own life. So I discovered all these new thinkers, Gene Gebser and McLuhan and a whole bunch of other people then started coming in. And one thing led to another, and I just kept moving on into different horizons. For a long time, I didn't like postmodernism, for instance. Not the slightest interest in reading or studying anything that the French had produced. Most of the characters I had come out of, the philosophers and so forth, were all German, and of German descent, German tradition. That's the kind of culture theory that I like, that culture morphological approach to culture theory. And I saw the French just as representing a threat to all of that. So for the longest time, I think well into my, early 40s, I just refused to read them. And I found them too difficult anyway. But then when I was writing Dead Celebrities, Living Icons, I knew the French, I knew Jean Baudrillard would have something very interesting to say about the phenomenon of the celebrity. So I started reading him out of curiosity. And indeed, he opened a whole door. And I started reading Paul Virilio, who's a friend of his, also a kind of media studies guy. And I read those two because I knew that there was an interface there with media studies. And so then after them, I started reading, Foucault and brought that in. Derrida was, of course, impossible until I'd read Heidegger. I'd had to go back then and read and learn Heidegger to get to Derrida. I don't think you can understand Derrida without reading Heidegger. That's just the fact of the matter. And a lot of people who sit down and try and get discouraged don't realize that you have to know Heidegger first. Go figure that out before you move on to Derrida. And then, of course, all the other wonderful French thinkers like Deleuze and Guattari. I'm losing my voice here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Wrap up. Yeah,
I really appreciate your time, John David.
Absolutely.
Ebert, and great fun.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. A privilege to come on.
Take care.
Okay, yeah, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.